The first time I saw them in my barn, my blood ran cold. There they were, three strangers in bright yellow vests, hammering at my old wooden shelves, moving boxes I'd spent years organizing, like they owned the place. And hovering behind them, with her arms crossed and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, was Karen, HOA Karen. She had that perfectly pressed blouse, tight curls bouncing, and that look that made you feel like you'd just broken some invisible law. I froze, standing at the doorway. My barn smelled of hay and old wood, the smell of home and memories, and now it was being invaded like some kind of property heist. My dogs barked, circling my legs, growling low. Karen didn't flinch. She just waved her clipboard, saying, "We're just here to make sure everything is up to code." Up to code? My barn hadn't had a single complaint in 20 years. I knew exactly what this was. Another one of Karen's power trips. Another way to make me feel small. Like I didn't belong here. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw myself at them. But instead, I did something that shocked even me. I didn't. I walked back into the house, grabbed my camera, and started filming. Every move they made, every box they touched. If Karen thought she could intimidate me, she had another thing coming. And in that moment, as the hammer fell one more time against my wooden shelves, I made a decision. I was going to stop this. But how? I was just one person, facing a board of rules, a Karen who thought she owned the world, and a team of workers who didn't care about me or my barn. The answer hit me in a flash, wild and reckless, and I smiled despite the fear creeping up my spine. I was going to put up my own fence. But I didn't stop there. I knew this wouldn't be a simple job. It was going to get messy. I didn't know it yet. But Karen wasn't going to let me put up that fence without a fight. And when I opened the barn door again to confront her, something happened that I never saw coming. Something that made my heart pound so fast it felt like it would burst. And it all started with a sound, one loud, echoing bang, like wood splitting under enormous pressure. I turned around, my camera still in hand, and saw the fence post they were using for the inspection suddenly crack, sending debris flying. My dogs yelped, and one of the workers stumbled back, dropping a box of my tools. And Karen froze, her perfect curls shaking slightly as her eyes widened. For a second, I thought she might actually be scared. Then she smiled. That sharp, dangerous smile that told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And in that moment, standing in the chaos of my own barn, I realized something. I had stepped into a game I didn't fully understand yet, a battle that was about to get much bigger than me. That was the day I decided to put up my own fence. And it wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about boundaries, respect, and finally standing up for myself. Little did I know, Karen had her own plans that would push me to my limits and test every ounce of patience, kindness, and courage I had. But before all that, I need to take you back a few weeks, to how it all started, to the small, quiet moments that seemed harmless at first. You see, this story didn't begin with hammering and shouting. It began with a knock on my door, a smile, and a friendly suggestion from Karen that would slowly spiral into chaos. I live in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone waves when they pass, and the lawns are neatly trimmed, and life feels easy. My barn sits at the edge of my property, filled with tools, old furniture, and memories. It's more than a building. It's a place of refuge, a place where I spend hours tinkering, creating, and dreaming. Karen, on the other hand, is the kind of person who thrives on control. She's on the HOA board, she knows the rules inside out, and she makes it her personal mission to enforce them, especially when she thinks someone is stepping out of line. At first, it was small things, a flower growing too tall, a mailbox that wasn't shiny enough, a lawn gnome placed slightly to the left. I ignored it, thinking, she's just quirky. But then, she started showing up at my barn. First, it was just a polite check-in. "We're inspecting the neighborhood structures," she said, clipboard in hand. I smiled, nodded, and went back to my work. But then the visits became more frequent. She brought workers with her people I didn't know, who wandered around my barn without permission. And every time, She made a little comment, a little threat disguised as a joke. "We just want to make sure you're following the rules. You wouldn't want any trouble, right?" I started to feel a mix of anger and sadness. Anger, because this was my property, my space, my sanctuary. And sadness, because Karen didn't seem to see me as a person, just another problem to manage, another target for her control. I realized I had two choices: continue letting her trample over me, or do something about it. And so, when that day came, when I walked into my barn to find her and her crew hammering away, I knew I couldn't stay passive any longer. That's when the idea hit me, putting up a fence. Yes, but more than that. A fence that wasn't just wood and nails, but a statement. A statement that my property, my life, and my space mattered. As I started measuring the land, digging post holes, and planning, I noticed something strange. Every time I dug a hole for a fence post, it felt like I was digging into my own courage. I realized that building this fence wasn't just about keeping Karen out, it was about reclaiming myself. Each post, each plank, each nail was a small victory, a moment of strength I hadn't recognized before. But just as I started nailing the first plank into place, I heard a familiar voice behind me. It was Karen. She had that same sharp tone, the one that made your skin crawl. "Are you seriously doing that without HOA approval?" she said, stepping closer. I looked at her, saw the arrogance in her eyes, and something in me snapped. I smiled calmly, like I had nothing to fear. "Yes," I said simply. "This is my property. I don't need your permission." Her face tightened, and I knew right then that the battle had officially begun. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about a barn or a fence. This was about standing up for myself in a world that sometimes doesn't respect boundaries. And just as I tightened the last screw in the first section of my fence, I heard it again, the loud, crashing sound from inside the barn. Something heavy had fallen, and I knew Karen's interference wasn't going to end quietly. I stepped back, heart racing, and looked toward the barn door, wondering what I was going to find next. "Where are you watching from?" I cautiously approached the barn, camera in hand, every step careful so I didn't trip over the scattered tools. The dog stayed close, ears perked. The smell of sawdust and hay mixed with a faint metallic tang. I realized it was my own blood from a small cut I'd gotten while setting up the fence. Not that it mattered right now. The real problem was inside the barn. When I pushed the door open, I froze. One of the workers had knocked over a large stack of boxes while trying to stabilize the cracked post from earlier. The boxes were spilling everywhere, old gardening supplies, cans of paint, and memories I hadn't touched in years. I felt a pang in my chest. These weren't just things, they were pieces of my life, snapshots of all the hours I had spent making this barn my own little sanctuary. Karen was standing off to the side, clipboard in hand, pretending to be calm. Her eyes, though, betrayed her excitement. She had that look, the one that said she thrived on seeing me stressed, frazzled, and vulnerable. "Well," she said, a mockingly cheerful tone, "I suppose accidents happen. Maybe you should clean this up properly." I took a deep breath, counting to 10. I had learned over the past few weeks that reacting impulsively only played into her hands. Instead, I calmly said, "I'll clean it up, but you and your team need to leave. You're not welcome here." One of the workers muttered something under his breath and left the barn, dragging a heavy box behind him. Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she didn't leave. She never left until she got what she wanted, and I knew this. She was testing me, pushing the limits, seeing how far she could go before I broke. I spent the next hour tidying the barn, carefully placing boxes back where they belonged. The dogs sniffed around, occasionally nuzzling my legs for reassurance. I realized that even in this chaos, there was still calm. There was still a rhythm to my life that no HOA board, no Karen could entirely take away. Once everything was back in place, I turned to the partially completed fence. It looked sturdy, yet incomplete, like a statement half-written. I ran my hands along the wooden planks, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingers. Each plank represented something more than just protection from intrusion. It represented my voice, my boundaries, my courage. The more I built, the more I understood. Standing up for yourself isn't about confrontation. It's about persistence. For the rest of the day, I worked quietly. I measured, dug post holes, and hammered nails with precise care. By evening, the first section of the fence was solid. I stepped back, wiping sweat from my brow, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. My dogs lay near my feet, their tails wagging lazily. And for a moment, everything felt normal again. The chaos of the morning seemed like a distant memory, and I allowed myself a small smile. Maybe I could do this. Maybe I could protect what was mine without losing my calm. But then came the knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost polite, but there was a weight behind it, a determination I knew well. I walked over and peeked through the window. It was Karen. Alone this time, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the fence, the barn, and me. She tapped the door again. I took a deep breath, unlocking it just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "I just wanted to check in," she said sweetly, stepping slightly closer. "It looks like you've been busy. That fence, it's very ambitious, isn't it?" I smiled politely. "It's my property, so yes, ambitious is fine." Her eyebrows lifted, as if she couldn't believe I had the audacity to speak so calmly. She paused, and then her smile returned, sharper this time. "Well, just remember, everything has rules, even fences." And just like that, she walked away, leaving a sense of unease in the air. I closed the door, leaned against it, and exhaled. For a moment, I felt proud. I had asserted myself without yelling, without losing control. But deep down, I knew Karen wouldn't stop there. This was just the beginning. That night, I sat in my living room, dogs curled up beside me, thinking about everything that had happened. I realized something important. Life is full of people like Karen. People who want to control, to dominate, to impose their will on others. But we have the power to choose how we respond. We can respond with anger, or we can respond with courage and persistence. I chose the latter. The next morning brought a quieter, almost serene start. Birds chirped outside, and the sun cast golden rays across my yard. I went back to the barn, intending to continue the fence. As I dug holes for the next posts, I noticed small things I hadn't before: a broken hinge on the barn door, some weeds growing along the fence line, a rusty nail sticking out from the old wood. It reminded me that life is never perfect, and sometimes the little imperfections make it more meaningful. As I hammered the next plank into place, I thought about kindness, about empathy, about how even someone like Karen, who seemed determined to make life difficult, probably had fears and insecurities driving her actions. It didn't excuse her behavior, but it reminded me that anger alone isn't always the answer. Sometimes, we have to build boundaries with compassion, not just wood and nails. I worked for hours, slowly creating a solid barrier that not only protected my property but symbolized my strength. And then, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, something happened. A loud, shattering noise came from the barn again. My heart leapt into my throat. I ran toward the sound, dogs barking furiously behind me. The door was open, swinging slightly, and inside, I saw the chaos. My carefully stacked boxes were on the floor again, and one of the workers who I hadn't seen arrive was frantically trying to stabilize a ladder that had toppled over. But it wasn't the worker or the fallen ladder that made my blood run cold. It was what had been revealed underneath. A section of the barn floor had been damaged, cracked wide enough to see the dark space below. Something heavy had fallen through, and the sound echoed like a warning. And there, just beyond the broken floorboard, I caught a glimpse of something I couldn't immediately identify, but it made my stomach twist in fear. A shadow? Or maybe something Karen had left behind? Before I could think further, I realized the worker had frozen, staring at the same spot. And Karen's voice came from outside, sharp and gleeful, carrying through the yard. "I told you, rules exist for a reason. You're going to learn that soon enough." I stepped back, heart pounding, knowing that this was only the beginning. The fence, the barn, the entire neighborhood, it was all about to become a battleground. And yet, deep inside, I felt a strange resolve. I wouldn't back down. I couldn't. The moment I stepped back from the broken floorboard, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum, I knew I had crossed into territory I wasn't prepared for. The barn, my sanctuary, suddenly felt alien. Shadows danced across the hay-strewn floor, and the smell of sawdust mixed with the metallic tang of fear. My dogs, normally calm and loyal, growled low, their hackles raised. Even they could sense something had shifted. I forced myself to breathe, counting slowly. 1, 2, 3. Each breath helped me regain a fraction of composure. I knew panicking would only make things worse. Slowly, I approached the damaged section, careful not to step on the splintered wood. The shadow beneath the crack flickered like a living thing, and my stomach twisted. Is someone down there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The worker who had been stabilizing the ladder didn't answer. He just stared, eyes wide, as if frozen by fear. I could feel the tension vibrating through the barn. Every sound amplified the creak of the roof, the scuff of my boots, the faint rustle of hay. I realized I needed light. Grabbing my flashlight from the workbench, I crouched and shone it into the crack. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a person, thankfully, but something had clearly fallen through. An old, rusted metal crate that I had completely forgotten about. Inside were tools, scattered papers, and oddly some old letters from my late grandfather. My heart sank. Those letters were priceless, filled with advice, memories, and stories of a simpler time. I quickly began to pull the crate out, carefully moving the scattered papers and tools. Each letter I held felt heavier than the last, a mix of nostalgia and panic. Who had moved the crate? Had it fallen during the chaos earlier, or had someone deliberately tipped it? My mind raced. Karen's presence outside, her voice echoing, told me this wasn't just an accident. She wanted to unsettle me, to make me doubt myself. Once the crate was safely upright, I leaned against the barn wall, taking a long breath. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow through the cracks in the barn walls. I realized that despite the chaos, the barn still felt like my own space. It wasn't perfect, it was damaged, but it was mine. That thought gave me a flicker of strength. I decided to step outside to inspect the fence I had been building. The first section, the part I had installed before the morning's chaos, looked solid. My hands brushed over the wooden planks, feeling their rough texture, feeling the quiet pride in what I had accomplished so far. I reminded myself that even though Karen could cause chaos, she couldn't erase the work I had already done. And then I noticed footprints in the dirt. Not my own, not mine or the workers. They led from the edge of the barn toward the unfinished section of the fence. My heart skipped. Someone had walked across my property while I was inside, and judging by the prints, it wasn't just a casual stroll. It was deliberate, as if whoever had been here wanted me to know they had been. I grabbed my camera again, filming the footprints, taking mental notes. Karen's smirk outside the barn made more sense now. She was sending messages, testing my boundaries, seeing how far she could push before I reacted. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every distant sound of wind through the trees made me jump. I kept imagining what might happen next. What if someone came into the barn while I slept? What if they tried to sabotage the fence? The anxiety was relentless, but I refused to let it control me. I reminded myself of something my grandfather had written in one of those old letters. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it. The next morning, I woke early, determined to continue building. The dogs, sensing my resolve, wagged their tails as I stepped into the yard. I grabbed my tools and started on the next section of the fence, hammering nails with precise determination. Each plank I installed felt like a small victory over fear, over chaos, over Karen's constant interference. But as I worked, I noticed the workers from the day before lingering near the edge of my property. They were just standing there, watching. I waved my hand politely, reminding myself that anger wouldn't help. One of them finally called out, "You're working hard. Just careful with that post, okay?" Their tone was almost neutral, almost kind, but I knew better. Karen had planted them there, subtly, to intimidate me. I shook my head and kept working. I refused to let their presence disrupt me. And for a few hours, things went surprisingly smoothly. The fence grew section by section, each plank fitting tighter than the last. I began to feel a rhythm, a sense of calm in the midst of the tension. It reminded me that life isn't just about the extremes, the crashes, the chaos, the sudden fear, but about the moments in between, the quiet progress, the small victories. By midday, the fence was halfway done. My arms ached, my hands were raw, but I felt proud. I stepped back and looked at the structure rising along the edge of my property. It wasn't just wood, it was a symbol of boundaries, courage, and self-respect. And then, just as I was about to take a short break, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop, a loud, metallic crash from the barn. My head snapped toward it. The crate from yesterday had been knocked over again, but this time, it was different. Something inside the crate had moved, clattering loudly, and when I shone my flashlight through the crack in the barn floor, I realized the crate was empty of the letters I had found. They were gone. I ran toward the barn, my heart pounding, dogs barking behind me. Karen's voice drifted from outside, faint but unmistakable. "You really thought it would be that easy, didn't you?" I reached the crate, emptied and tipped over. Panic surged through me. Who had taken the letters? Had the workers done it? Or was Karen herself behind this? And then I noticed another thing, a piece of paper pinned to the barn wall, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I walked over and picked it up, my hands trembling. It was a note, written in neat, precise handwriting. "Next time, it won't just be letters." I froze. My mind raced. Was this a threat? A warning? How far would Karen go? And more importantly, what would I do next? At that moment, I knew one thing for certain. The game had escalated. Karen wasn't just testing me anymore. She was actively trying to intimidate and manipulate me. And yet, deep down, a strange resolve formed. I couldn't back down. I wouldn't. I had started this fence for a reason, and I would finish it, no matter what came next. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow moving outside the barn, fast and deliberate, too quick to be human. My heart stopped. Something or someone was out there, watching, waiting. And I realized this was only the beginning. The shadow lingered at the edge of my barn like a dark stain against the fading sunlight. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight tighter, illuminating the yard but revealing nothing definitive, just long, wavering shadows of trees stretching across the fence I was building. My dogs growled, circling my feet, their ears flat against their heads. The feeling in the pit of my stomach told me that this wasn't a random passerby. Someone or something was out there, watching, waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I reminded myself of the letters, of the crate, and of Karen's note pinned on the barn wall. Next time, it won't just be letters. Those words had stuck in my mind like a needle. But instead of backing down, I felt a strange surge of determination. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my actions. I had started this fence to protect my property, my sanctuary, my life. I wouldn't stop now. I stepped outside the barn slowly, flashlight in hand, scanning every corner of my yard. The shadow was gone. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or maybe the person had retreated. Either way, I knew I had to act carefully. I didn't want to escalate things further, but I also couldn't let my property be invaded again. As I walked toward the unfinished section of the fence, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt, different from yesterday's, heavier and deeper. Someone had clearly been there overnight. My heart pounded as I crouched down to inspect them. The prints were deliberate, leading toward the barn and then circling back toward the street. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide. They wanted me to see. I felt a mix of fear and anger, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. I needed to continue building the fence. The work was physically exhausting, but there was something almost meditative about hammering nails, aligning planks, and digging post holes. Each section completed felt like a small victory, a tangible assertion of my boundaries. Around midday, I took a short break, wiping sweat from my brow and drinking water. I glanced toward the barn and noticed something that made my stomach drop, a ladder leaning against the side, which hadn't been there before. My mind immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. Had someone climbed onto the roof? Were they trying to sabotage the barn from above? I moved closer cautiously, flashlight ready, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response, only silence, except for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I exhaled, realizing I might be overreacting. Yet the unease didn't go away. I knew Karen's tactics. She thrived on subtle intimidation, on creating fear, without ever directly confronting. And this felt exactly like her style. Determined not to let it control me, I returned to the fence, hammering nails with more intensity than before. The physical effort helped channel my frustration and fear into something productive. My dog stayed close, sensing my focus and offering a quiet, grounding presence. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed movement near the far edge of the property. 3 workers, unfamiliar faces, were standing near the neighbor's yard, observing me. They didn't approach, didn't speak, just watched. I immediately recognized the tactic. Karen had sent them, likely hoping I'd react angrily or make a mistake. But I stayed calm, waving politely from a distance. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Hours passed with a tense routine, hammering, measuring, and glancing over my shoulder. By early evening, the fence was nearly complete. The first and second sections were solid, standing as silent statements of ownership and resilience. I felt a small sense of triumph, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming, something more dangerous. And then it happened. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the yard. I froze, heart hammering. It came from the barn, louder and more deliberate than before. My flashlight beam darted toward the sound. The barn door swung violently, as if something had struck it from the inside. My dogs barked furiously, hackles raised, teeth bared. I ran toward the barn, adrenaline surging through me. The crate that had been empty yesterday was now overturned again, papers scattered across the floor. But it wasn't the crate that made my blood run cold. A shadow moved inside, human-sized, quick, deliberate. Whoever it was didn't seem afraid of me at all. They moved with purpose, heading toward the barn's interior. I called out, voice shaking but firm. "Stop. Who's there?" No answer. Only the sound of footsteps, the scraping of metal against wood, and a faint, mocking laugh. It was a laugh I would never forget, crisp, calculated, and entirely devoid of warmth. Karen. I knew it. I realized then that this was the escalation I had feared. This wasn't just about letters, or crates, or fence boundaries. This was about control. Karen wanted to make me feel powerless, and in her mind, sending herself or her workers into my barn while I was present was the ultimate power move. I had to think fast. I grabbed the nearest plank of wood from my unfinished fence section and held it like a shield. The dog stood beside me, growling, ready to defend. My mind raced through options, calling the police, confronting the intruder, or trying to trap them inside. But before I could decide, the shadow bolted past me, out the barn door, and toward the street. I followed, heart pounding, adrenaline surging. But by the time I reached the yard, the figure was gone. Only a faint trail of footprints remained, disappearing toward the main road. I dropped the plank, breathing heavily, feeling both relief and frustration. Whoever it was, they had made their point. They had invaded my space and escaped without consequence. I glanced back at the barn. The damage was minimal, scratched wood, scattered papers. But the message was clear. Karen's interference wasn't going to stop. She would continue testing me, pushing boundaries, escalating her tactics, and I knew I had to be prepared. That night, I sat in my living room, dogs curled around my feet, staring at the fence from the window. The completed section stood tall, solid, and unyielding. I allowed myself a small smile. The fence wasn't just wood and nails, it was courage, persistence, and determination made tangible. But I also knew the battle was far from over. As I turned to go to bed, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. "You're getting closer, But closer to what? My blood ran cold. Karen. No doubt about it. She was watching, waiting, and planning her next move. I realized then that this wasn't just about a barn, a fence, or letters. This was about boundaries, respect, and standing up to someone who thrived on fear and control. And as I lay awake that night, listening to the wind outside and the faint creak of the barn, I understood one truth. Karen wouldn't stop until she either won or I proved her wrong. The next morning, I woke to an eerie quiet. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft, golden glow over my yard. Normally, this was the time I felt at peace, the birds singing, the morning dew sparkling, but today, even the chirping of the birds felt tense, as if they, too, were wary of what might happen next. My dogs stayed close, nudging my legs with concern. I could feel their unease. I went outside to inspect the yard and the fence. The sections I had completed yesterday stood firm, but I noticed something odd. The planks of the first section weren't aligned perfectly. At first, I thought I had mismeasured, but then I realized it wasn't my handiwork that caused the misalignment. Someone had tampered with it. The nails had been loosened, the planks shifted slightly. Karen's presence, or at least the shadow of her influence, was still there, lurking. I took a deep breath and reminded myself. Fear is a tool. It can either control you or motivate you. I chose the latter. I spent the morning tightening nails, realigning planks, and reinforcing the sections I had completed. The physical effort was exhausting, but with each hammer strike, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. Every section I completed was proof that I wasn't going to be intimidated. Around midday, I decided to check the barn. I needed to see the damage from the previous night up close. The floorboards had minor scratches, and the crate was overturned again, but thankfully the letters were still safe. They must have been in my pocket when I ran outside. I took a moment to breathe, running my fingers over the worn wood of the crate. These letters represented more than words. They were a connection to my past, to my grandfather, to the lessons he had taught me about courage and resilience. I began organizing the barn, putting tools back in place, sweeping sawdust, and stacking boxes carefully. My dogs followed, occasionally pawing at a stray paper or sniffing a box. The work was grounding, a reminder that despite Karen's attempts to disrupt my life, I still controlled what mattered most to me. By late afternoon, I heard voices. Not the workers from before, but closer, sharper, deliberate, and confident. My heart raced. I peeked outside and saw Karen standing near the fence line, clipboard in hand, watching me. She wasn't smiling this time. Her expression was hard, focused, calculating. She seemed to be studying every move I made. I swallowed my anxiety and walked toward her, dogs at my side. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Karen's eyes narrowed. "I see you're continuing the fence project," she said, her voice clipped. "Ambitious, but I must remind you that any modifications to your property need HOA approval." I took a deep breath. I had rehearsed this moment in my head countless times. "Karen," I said calmly, "this is my property. I don't need your approval to build a fence that protects it." Her gaze flicked toward the fence, lingering on the sections I had completed. She pursed her lips and then leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice. "You're making this very personal, aren't you? Be careful. Not everything is as it seems." I didn't flinch. I nodded politely and returned to my work, hammering a plank into place. Every strike of the hammer was deliberate, a small act of defiance and self-assertion. Karen stayed for a few moments longer, watching silently, then turned and walked away. I exhaled, feeling both relief and dread. I knew she wasn't done, not by a long shot. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave the barn, I noticed something strange. A small envelope had been tucked into one of the boxes I had just stacked. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a note, written in precise, elegant handwriting, the same style as the note pinned to the barn wall before. It read, "Some boundaries can be moved, others cannot. Which will you choose?" My stomach churned. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was a game, and Karen was clearly orchestrating it with careful strategy. Whoever was behind these notes understood psychology, understood fear, and was attempting to manipulate me. But instead of cowering, I felt a quiet determination. I wasn't going to let anyone dictate my boundaries or my life. I spent the next few hours reinforcing the fence and planning the final sections. Each post, each plank, felt symbolic, a tangible representation of courage, determination, and respect for myself. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. The fence was nearly complete, but I knew the final work would be the most challenging. Karen would escalate her tactics, and I had to be ready. That night, I double-checked the barn, securing windows and doors. I placed locks on sections of the barn that had previously been tampered with and set up my camera to record any movement outside. I wanted evidence, not just for my own protection, but to understand the full scope of Karen's interference. I felt a small sense of satisfaction as the camera blinked to life. The barn was quiet, the yard dark and still, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could regain control. But then, just as I was about to head inside for the night, a sound shattered the silence, a loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. My heart jumped into my throat. The noise came from the newly installed fence. I ran outside, flashlight in hand, and saw it immediately. One of the newly secured sections had been ripped from its post, lying in a heap of broken wood on the ground. I froze. My blood ran cold. Karen's note, the shadow, the stolen letters, and now this deliberate destruction. It was all connected. Whoever did this wanted to send a clear message. My efforts to assert boundaries were not welcome. I ran toward the broken section, my hands trembling as I examined the damage. The wood was splintered, but not completely destroyed. Someone had used significant force, enough to intimidate, but not enough to fully destroy the fence. Whoever it was had planned it carefully, timing it for when I would see it. As I stood there, heart racing, I noticed a figure retreating into the darkness, slender, quick, and unmistakably confident. It was Karen. She paused briefly, watching me, then disappeared down the street. My dogs barked furiously, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and the message was clear. Karen wouldn't stop until she felt she had complete control. I stood in the yard, looking at the broken fence, feeling a mix of fear, anger, and determination. I realized that this battle wasn't just about property or letters or a barn. It was about standing up for myself, setting boundaries, and refusing to let anyone, no matter how persistent, dictate my life. And as I picked up the broken wood, my hands shaking but my resolve firm, I knew one thing for certain. I would rebuild. Stronger. Smarter. And this time, Karen would have no easy victories. The broken fence lay in my yard like a scar, mocking my determination. I knelt beside the splintered wood, running my fingers over the jagged edges, my mind a whirlpool of frustration, fear, and resolve. Karen's interference had escalated far beyond a test of patience. This was now an outright challenge. She had crossed a line, and yet, amidst the fear and anger, I felt a flicker of determination. I refused to let her win. My dogs padded close, noses to the ground, sniffing cautiously at the splintered wood. Their presence comforted me. They had been my silent companions through all of Karen's petty invasions, from the first crate disturbance to the note pinned inside the barn. Now, they seemed to sense that the next step required not just physical effort, but strategy. I started gathering the pieces of the broken fence, noting which sections were salvageable and which were too damaged to reuse. Each plank I touched felt heavier than before, weighed down by the implications of Karen's message. But I knew I couldn't let fear control me. I had to rebuild, and not just rebuild, but improve. As I worked, I thought back to the letters from my grandfather. One of them, written decades ago, resonated more than ever. Sometimes the strongest fences are built not with wood, but with patience and persistence. His words reminded me that victory wouldn't come from reacting impulsively or with anger. It would come from careful, deliberate action. I took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. By midday, I had cleared the debris and organized the salvageable planks. I decided to reinforce the fence with additional supports, making it stronger than before. I measured carefully, ensuring each post was driven deep into the ground. Hammering the nails with precision, I felt a rhythm develop, a steady heartbeat of determination. My hands grew sore, my arms ached, but every strike of the hammer was an affirmation. I would not back down. Despite the physical labor, my mind remained alert. I knew Karen wouldn't stop with just one act of destruction. She thrived on subtle psychological manipulation, and I anticipated her next move. That anticipation made every shadow suspicious, every sound in the yard a potential threat. But I refused to let paranoia control me. I focused instead on progress. Around late afternoon, I noticed movement near the barn's edge. A vehicle had pulled up slowly, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. My heart leapt. Karen's sedan. I watched from behind the partially rebuilt fence as she stepped out, clipboard in hand, surveying the yard with that signature expression, confident, calculating, unyielding. She wasn't smiling this time. Her eyes scanned every plank, every post, every detail of the fence I had painstakingly reconstructed. I exhaled slowly, reminding myself to stay calm. I approached cautiously, dogs flanking me, and spoke clearly. "Karen, I'm working. Please stay on your side of the property." Her gaze flicked toward me, sharp and assessing. "I see you've been busy," she said, her voice calm but tinged with a hint of menace. "Ambitious, but rebuilding alone won't solve everything. Some problems need professional intervention." I bristled at the implication. "This is my property. I don't need your approval, or anyone else's, to protect it." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she leaned slightly closer. "We'll see," she said, simply before turning and walking toward her car. Her steps were deliberate, echoing across the yard like a warning. She didn't need to say more. The message was clear. She was watching, waiting, planning her next move. I returned to the fence, hands trembling slightly but determination steady. I reinforced each section more carefully than before, ensuring the posts were deeper, the planks stronger. I worked until the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. The nearly completed fence stood taller, sturdier, more defiant than ever. As darkness approached, I double-checked the barn and the surrounding area. I secured doors, reinforced windows, and placed my camera in a discreet location to record any movement overnight. My dogs lay at my feet, alert but calm, sensing that the day's battle had ended for now. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. Karen had tried to intimidate me, but I had responded not with anger, but with persistence. That night, I sat in the living room, reviewing the footage from my camera. My eyes widened as I noticed movement around the barn. A shadow passed quickly, just out of reach of the camera's view. Someone had been there, tampering with the barn, moving silently, carefully. The realization hit me. Karen's interference was escalating. She wasn't just testing me now. She was actively trying to sabotage my property and unsettle me psychologically. I felt a chill run down my spine. But as fear threatened to overwhelm, I remembered another piece of advice from my grandfather's letters. Courage isn't about facing what's easy. It's about standing tall when everything tries to knock you down. I held on to that thought, letting it steady my nerves. The next morning, I woke early, determined to finish the fence once and for all. I gathered tools, measured posts, and began installing the final sections. The sun rose slowly, bathing the yard in a warm light that contrasted sharply with the tension lingering in the air. Each plank I hammered in place felt like reclaiming a piece of control, a small victory against the constant pressure Karen imposed. By mid-morning, the fence was nearly complete. The structure now formed a solid boundary, a visible assertion of ownership and resolve. I stepped back to admire my work, feeling a rare sense of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, I felt the possibility of peace, however temporary, on my property. But just as I was about to pack up, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold, a loud metallic clang from the barn. My heart leapt. I ran toward the sound, flashlight in hand. The barn door swung open violently, and inside, chaos awaited. The crate that had held my grandfather's letters was overturned once again, tools and papers scattered across the floor. But this time, The crate had been broken open, its contents strewn as if in deliberate mockery. My stomach twisted in anger and fear. And then I noticed something even more alarming. The camera I had set up overnight had been knocked to the floor, lens shattered. I froze. Whoever had done this had been inside my barn, moving with confidence, knowing exactly what they were doing. And as I looked up, I saw a figure standing in the shadows, near the far wall, slender, dark, deliberate. A presence I immediately recognized, Karen. She stepped forward, a faint smile on her lips, clipboard in hand. "You've been busy," she said calmly, almost kindly. "But you still don't understand. Boundaries are meant to be tested." I realized then that this was no longer just a fight over property. It was a battle of wills, a test of courage and persistence. And I knew with a sinking certainty that Karen's escalation had only just begun. I froze, heart hammering, as Karen stepped fully into the barn, her presence filling the space with an almost tangible tension. The faint smell of sawdust and hay mixed with something colder, something deliberate, calculated. My dogs growled low, their hackles raised, circling between me and her. This was different from before. This wasn't just intimidation or indirect interference, this was a full-on invasion of my sanctuary. Karen's eyes scanned the scattered tools and papers, lingering briefly on the crate that had held my grandfather's letters. "You've made progress," she said smoothly, clipboard in hand, tapping it lightly against her leg. "But progress alone isn't enough. You still need guidance." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to remain calm. "Guidance? You mean control? You've been trying to control me, my property, my life." I said firmly, "This ends now. You leave, or I call the police." She tilted her head, a small smirk playing on her lips. "Call the police if you like. They'll see you've been working on your property, won't they? But tell me, how long will your courage last when faced with someone who never stops?" Her words were meant to unsettle me, but I refused to let them. Instead, I focused on the fence outside, nearly complete. A symbol of my persistence. The physical structure gave me strength. Karen may have entered my barn, may have destroyed and tampered with things, but the fence reminded me I was capable of defending what was mine. I stepped forward cautiously, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not afraid of you. I will finish the fence. I will protect my barn, and you will leave." Karen's smirk widened. "Such determination," she said, almost admiringly. "But let's see if it holds." Suddenly, I heard a noise from the back of the barn, a faint creaking, almost imperceptible, like the floorboards shifting. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing, just shadows stretching across the walls. My dogs barked, low and urgent, clearly sensing the same threat I did. My heart raced. Something was happening beneath the surface. Then, without warning, the floorboard under the crate collapsed entirely with a loud crash, sending tools and scattered papers tumbling into a small hole that had suddenly formed in the barn floor. Dust and debris filled the air. I stumbled back, catching myself against the wall, heart racing. Karen, surprisingly composed, leaned slightly forward, her eyes gleaming with excitement or perhaps satisfaction. "You see," she said softly, almost mockingly, "some things are fragile, even when you think they're secure." I stared at the gaping hole, my mind spinning. The crate, the letters, the tools they had all fallen into a dark cavity beneath the barn. My grandfather's letters. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They could be damaged, lost, or worse. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to think logically. Panic would not solve this. I had to act quickly. I grabbed a sturdy plank from the nearby workbench and approached the hole cautiously, a flashlight in hand. My dogs stayed at my side, growling softly but obedient. I peered into the darkness. It was deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom, but I could make out the scattered shapes of the tools and papers. The letters, I prayed silently, were intact. Karen watched silently, clipboard clutched in her hand. She didn't move, didn't intervene, just observed, as if the situation was some test she had set up. I realized then that this was precisely what she wanted. To make me feel powerless, to watch my panic, and to see how I would respond under pressure. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. There was only one option. I needed to retrieve the items from the hole, carefully and methodically. I found a rope in the barn, tied it securely around a plank, and lowered it gently into the cavity, trying to hook the crate. It took time, careful adjustments, repeated attempts, but eventually, I managed to pull the crate partially back up. Dust and dirt rained down, covering me in a thin layer of grit, but I refused to be deterred. With one final heave, the crate came fully out of the hole, tipping onto the barn floor. I quickly grabbed the letters, brushing off debris, inspecting them carefully. Miraculously, they were intact edges, slightly frayed, but otherwise unharmed. My hands trembled as I clutched them close. Karen's eyes followed every movement, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she spoke. "Impressive," she said softly. "You've shown resilience, but resilience alone won't protect you forever." I ignored her, placing the crate back on a secure section of the barn floor and stacking tools neatly around it. My hands shook, but not with fear this time. It was adrenaline and triumph. I had faced an extreme situation, a direct intrusion into my property, and I had acted with determination and clarity. But the victory was temporary. As I stepped back to examine my work, I noticed something outside the barn window, a figure moving quickly across the yard toward the fence. My heart skipped. Another escalation. Another test. Someone or Karen herself was tampering with the fence. I ran to the window, flashlight in hand, and saw the figure crouched near the newly completed sections, working deliberately. My stomach sank. This wasn't just testing boundaries anymore. It was sabotage, direct and immediate. I bolted outside, dogs barking furiously, and shouted, "Stop! Get away from my property!" The figure froze for a moment, then darted toward the trees bordering my yard. By the time I reached the spot, they were gone, vanished into the shadows. Only the faint footprints and the disturbance of the recently installed fence remained. My heart pounded as I examined the damage. Several planks had been loosened, some partially torn from their posts. Karen's presence or her influence was escalating rapidly. I stood in the yard, catching my breath, heart racing, adrenaline surging. The fence was nearly complete, the barn secured, yet the sense of constant threat lingered. Karen's intrusion had not only endangered my property but had reminded me how fragile boundaries could be when faced with someone determined to break them. And then, just as I turned to head back inside, a sharp, metallic clang echoed from the far edge of the property. I froze. My stomach dropped. Something heavy had struck the fence, or worse. I ran toward the sound, flashlight sweeping across the yard, and my breath caught in horror. The final, reinforced section of the fence, my crowning achievement, had been ripped violently from its posts, lying in a heap of splintered wood. And standing beside it, clipboard in hand, was Karen herself, smiling triumphantly. She looked at me with a mix of satisfaction and challenge in her eyes. I realized then, with a sinking certainty, that this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over. Karen was escalating, and the stakes had never been higher. I froze, staring at Karen standing beside the splintered remains of the fence, her clipboard tucked under her arm as if nothing had happened. The audacity, the sheer nerve, it was staggering. My heart pounded, my fists clenched, and my dogs barked furiously, circling between me and her. Every fiber of my body screamed for action, yet I knew I had to remain calm. Reacting impulsively would play directly into her hands. She looked at me and smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made my stomach twist. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" she said softly, almost mockingly. "But boundaries are meant to be tested, always." I swallowed my frustration and stepped forward. "You've gone too far, Karen. This is my property. I will not let you destroy it or intimidate me any longer." Karen tilted her head, as if considering my words. "And yet, here we are. I wonder, how far are you willing to go to defend what's yours?" Her gaze swept across the yard, over the barn, and lingering on the damaged fence. It was a challenge, a silent dare. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline surge through me. This was more than just a confrontation. It was a test of courage, patience, and strategy. The fence, the barn, my grandfather's letters, all of it symbolized not just property, but my determination, my resilience. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. I turned my attention to the damaged fence. The planks were splintered, some barely hanging from the posts. My hands shook as I examined the destruction, but I refused to succumb to despair. Instead, I formulated a plan. I would rebuild again, but this time, stronger, smarter, and with added reinforcements that Karen wouldn't anticipate. Each post would be deeper, each plank secured with multiple fasteners, and I would use metal brackets to ensure stability. Karen's expression remained calm, almost pleased, as if she were enjoying the spectacle of my resolve. "I see determination in you," she said. "It's admirable, but admirable doesn't always mean victorious." I ignored her and began gathering tools. The physical labor would help center me, allow me to focus on tangible progress rather than the psychological games she was playing. I worked methodically, measuring, sawing, and aligning posts. Every strike of the hammer was deliberate, an assertion of control over my space, a refusal to be intimidated. Hours passed in this rhythm, the sun climbing higher and casting sharp shadows across the yard. Karen remained on the sidelines, clipboard in hand, occasionally jotting notes. I realized that she wasn't just testing me physically. She was observing, analyzing my responses, seeing how I handled stress and adversity. It was a subtle form of psychological warfare, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me falter. By mid-afternoon, I had made significant progress. Several sections of the fence were rebuilt, reinforced with extra support, and standing sturdier than ever. My hands were raw, my arms ached, but a sense of pride and accomplishment buoyed me. This was more than a fence. It was a testament to persistence, courage, and self-respect. Yet, the quiet moments of triumph were always followed by tension. As I adjusted the final plank, I heard a faint rustling near the barn. My heart skipped. I turned, flashlight in hand, and saw movement near the edge of the property. A figure crouched low, working deliberately on the remaining fence sections. Karen's signature smirk appeared as she straightened from her hiding spot behind the barn. "I see you're improving," she said. "But let's see how you handle this." Before I could react, a loud, metallic snap rang out. The post I had just reinforced splintered under an unseen force. My heart leapt, and my dogs barked, growling fiercely. I ran toward the fence, flashlight sweeping across the yard, and saw the damage. One of the newly installed sections was torn from its posts, lying in a heap of broken wood. I froze, realizing that this was no accident. Karen or someone under her direction was escalating again. The message was clear. My progress, my persistence, my hard work, they were not enough to deter her. I ran toward the damaged section, examining the splintered wood. Whoever had done this had used significant force, carefully applied to maximize destruction while avoiding detection. The precision was unnerving. This wasn't random vandalism. It was deliberate sabotage, a calculated act to undermine my confidence and control. Karen stepped closer, clipboard tapping against her leg. "You see," she said softly, almost kindly, "determination is admirable, but determination without strategy is fragile." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to remain calm. I realized she was trying to provoke me, to push me into reacting impulsively. But I had learned something over these past weeks. Fear could be managed, chaos could be faced, and determination could be strengthened. I took a deep breath and spoke, voice firm. "I will rebuild, stronger than before, and I will not let you intimidate me." Her smile widened. "We shall see," she said, turning and retreating toward the edge of the property. But as she moved, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A faint glint in the grass, near where the fence had been torn down. I walked closer, flashlight illuminating the object. It was a small metal device, something I didn't recognize immediately. A simple, crude mechanism, yet placed deliberately. My mind raced. Was it meant to destabilize the fence further? A trap? Karen had clearly escalated her tactics beyond direct interference into something more sinister, more deliberate. I carefully examined the device, realizing its potential danger. Whoever placed it had knowledge of mechanics, knew how to exploit weaknesses, and intended to maximize disruption. My hands trembled as I secured it, disabling it as best I could. The adrenaline surged again, sharper than before. Karen's reach, her determination to control and intimidate, was far greater than I had anticipated. I looked at the fence, the barn, and the crate with my grandfather's letters. Each element represented a test, a challenge, a boundary Karen was determined to breach. And yet, despite the fear, the destruction, and the intimidation, I felt a quiet determination welling up inside me. I would not be defeated. Hours later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, I stood back and examined the nearly completed fence. Every post reinforced, every plank secure, every section stronger than before. Karen's sabotage had been methodical, deliberate, and intimidating, but I had endured. I had rebuilt. I had asserted control. But the evening's calm was shattered by a sudden, terrifying sound, a loud crash from the barn, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. My heart leapt into my throat. I ran toward the barn, dogs barking frantically, and froze in horror. The main support beam in the center of the barn had collapsed. Dust and debris filled the air, and the crate with my grandfather's letters teetered dangerously on the edge of the wreckage. Karen's presence was unmistakable. Standing just outside the barn door, the clipboard in hand, she looked on, calm and triumphant, as if the destruction were a victory. I realized, with a sinking certainty, that this battle was far from over. Karen's escalation had reached a terrifying new level, and the stakes had never been higher. The dust hung thick in the barn, heavy and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. I coughed, waving my hands in front of my face as I tried to see through the haze. The main support beam had collapsed with a deafening crash, sending the crate teetering on the edge and scattering tools, letters, and sawdust across the floor. My dogs barked incessantly, their bodies tense, ears flat against their heads. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I forced myself to focus. Panic wouldn't help me save my property or my grandfather's letters. Karen stood near the barn door, calm, collected, and disturbingly pleased with the destruction. She didn't move to help, didn't apologize, didn't even offer a word beyond a faint smirk. It was clear she wanted to see the chaos, to watch the fear and frustration flare. I could feel her gaze on me like a physical weight, calculating, measuring my response. I rushed forward, grabbing the crate with as much care as I could manage. My hands trembled from adrenaline and exhaustion, but the letters were intact, edges, dust-covered and slightly bent, but otherwise unharmed. I placed the crate on a secure workbench at the side of the barn, carefully stacking heavy tools around it to ensure no further damage. Relief surged through me, but it was quickly tempered by the knowledge that this was only a temporary reprieve. Karen tilted her head, watching silently. "You're resourceful," she said softly, almost admiringly. "But how much can one person endure before it's too much?" I straightened, brushing dust from my arms. "I will endure, and I will protect what's mine, no matter how much you try to stop me." My voice was steady, though my chest heaved from exertion and the sheer intensity of the moment. Karen's smirk widened. "Bold words," she said, "but words alone won't save you." She turned abruptly and walked toward the yard, clipboard still in hand. I realized then that she wasn't finished with her game. The barn was only part of it. The fence, the yard, the perimeter of my property were all fair targets in her eyes. I glanced outside, surveying the nearly completed fence. It was sturdy, reinforced, almost impervious to casual tampering. But I knew Karen would test it further. Her methods were methodical and escalating. She didn't act randomly. Every action was deliberate, every escalation calculated. Determined not to be caught off guard, I began inspecting the yard. I checked the fence posts, the locks on gates, and even the surrounding trees for possible points of access. My dogs trailed behind, alert, their eyes scanning the perimeter. The physical labor and mental focus gave me a sense of control, countering the anxiety that had built up over weeks of harassment. By mid-afternoon, I had made small but important repairs to the fence, ensuring every section was reinforced and every post secured. The barn, while damaged, was now stabilized, with beams reinforced and the crate safely protected. I took a moment to breathe, the sun warm on my back, trying to savor a brief sense of accomplishment. For the first time in days, I felt that maybe, just maybe, I was regaining some control. But that calm was short-lived. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, I noticed movement near the far edge of the property. Figures, 3 of them were moving quickly, almost too deliberately to be casual observers. My heart raced. The workers. Karen had sent them again, likely to finish what she had started with the barn and the fence. I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the gate, dogs barking furiously. "Stay back," I shouted, but they ignored me, moving with purpose, carrying tools that looked far too large for simple maintenance. They were here to intimidate, to escalate the situation further. I realized then that I needed to act decisively. Running or hiding would only embolden them. I grabbed a nearby metal post from the pile I had been using for the fence and positioned myself between the intruders and the barn. My hands were steady despite the fear, my stance firm. I would not let them enter the barn, not while I was present. The workers froze momentarily, startled by my resolve, and one of them stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, we were just sent to inspect." "Inspect?" I shouted, my voice echoing across the yard. "This is private property. Leave now, or I call the police." Karen's voice suddenly cut through the tension. "Calm down," she said from the far side of the yard, clipboard in hand. "We're only trying to help." But help comes in many forms, some more forceful than others. I swallowed hard, realizing that this was exactly what she wanted, to make me feel isolated, threatened, and uncertain. But I refused to give her that power. I stood firm, my dogs growling at the intruders, ready to defend. The situation was tense, silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of traffic. I knew any sudden movement could trigger chaos. Then, without warning, the workers made a move toward the fence, attempting to loosen a post I had just reinforced. My heart leapt into my throat. I ran toward them, shouting and swinging the metal post in the air as a warning. The intruders froze, startled by my aggression, and one stumbled backward, tripping over the uneven ground. My dogs lunged, barking furiously, adding to the chaos. Karen, still standing at a safe distance, watched with that same calm, calculating smile. The moment of calm shattered when I heard a loud, snapping sound. A rope strung between 2 trees near the far corner of the yard had been pulled taut, and a heavy metal hook swung down violently toward me. I barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as it missed by mere inches. My heart raced, my mind spun. Karen's escalation had gone from psychological intimidation to physical danger. I stumbled backward, barely maintaining my balance, and realized the stakes had shifted dramatically. This was no longer just about a fence, a barn, or letters. This was about safety, mine, my property, and everything I cared about. Karen's voice rang out calmly, almost teasingly, from across the yard. "Resilient, aren't you? But resilience can only go so far." My eyes followed the swinging hook, the intruders frozen in place, and the broken fence sections scattered across the yard. My heart pounded. This was the extreme event I had feared: direct, calculated, dangerous, and I knew that the next move I made could determine everything. The metal hook swung through the air with terrifying speed, barely missing me. My dogs barked and lunged toward it, teeth bared, but the danger had already shifted the entire atmosphere of the yard. The adrenaline surged through my veins, making my heartbeat thunderingly loud in my ears. Karen's presence, calm and deliberate across the yard, was unnerving. She wasn't even hiding anymore. She was openly watching, calculating, as if orchestrating this entire scene like a director with a dark sense of satisfaction. I staggered backward, gripping the metal post tightly in my hands. My legs felt unsteady. but I knew I couldn't let fear control me. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about my safety, my property, and the principle that no one had the right to terrorize me. I realized that if I didn't act decisively, things could get far worse, fast. The intruders, 3 of Karen's hired hands, hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Their confidence faltered under the combined weight of my presence and my dog's aggression. I could see the tension in their bodies, the uncertainty flickering across their faces. They weren't used to this level of resistance. This gave me a slight edge, but only a slight one. Karen's voice cut through the tension, calm and deliberate. "Stand down, or this could get messy. Remember, resilience can only go so far." Her words were calculated, designed to make me doubt myself. But I focused instead on the reinforced fence and the barn, the tangible symbols of my persistence. They reminded me that I had survived every previous attack, and I could survive this one too. I took a deep breath and made a decision. I couldn't just react. I had to think strategically. I waved my hands, keeping my stance strong, and shouted firmly at the intruders, "This is private property. Step back now, or I call the police." My voice carried authority, and I hoped it would break the fragile confidence of Karen's hired hands. For a moment, silence. Then, one of the intruders took a hesitant step back. Another followed. I held my ground, raising the metal post slightly as a warning. Not to attack, but to assert control. My dogs remained alert, their bodies tense but under my command. I realized that this combination of calm authority, preparation, and readiness to defend was as much a weapon as any physical tool. Karen's smirk faded slightly as she observed the shift in dynamics. "Interesting," she said, her voice quieter, almost contemplative. "You've learned to stand your ground. But how far will you go?" Before I could respond, a sudden noise from behind startled me, a loud splintering crack. I turned just in time to see the last remaining fence section, the one closest to the barn, snap violently under some unseen force. The reinforced posts bent, splintering wood and metal scattering across the yard. My heart lurched. The workers froze, eyes wide with fear, as the debris clattered against the ground. Karen stepped forward slowly, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. "You see?" she said, voice low and deliberate. "Even the strongest boundaries can be broken with the right pressure." I ran toward the damaged section of the fence, examining the wreckage. Whoever had caused this had knowledge of weak points, leverage, and timing. It wasn't random. It wasn't sloppy. It was precise and deliberate, a calculated escalation of intimidation. My jaw tightened. Karen had crossed another line, pushing the conflict to a new level. I looked around, assessing the yard. My barn was still standing, the letters were safe, and the majority of the fence was intact, but the psychological weight of Karen's latest action pressed heavily on me. She wasn't just testing boundaries anymore. She was demonstrating power. Every previous act, every note, every tampered crate, and every destroyed plank had been leading to this escalation. I realized then that this confrontation couldn't continue indefinitely without outside intervention. I couldn't simply wait for Karen to make the next move. I needed a plan, a strategy that would protect my property and assert my authority decisively. I began organizing tools, gathering extra reinforcements for the fence, and double-checking locks and security measures around the barn. My dogs stayed close, alert to any further movements. Karen watched silently, her clipboard forgotten for a moment, as I worked methodically. She wasn't interfering directly now, at least. Not yet, but her presence was an oppressive reminder that she was still orchestrating this battle from the shadows. Every instinct in my body screamed that the next move would be significant, that she had saved her most extreme tactic for last. Hours passed in a tense, quiet rhythm. I reinforced the remaining fence sections, repaired damage, and double-checked every plank and post. I also secured the barn once again, placing additional supports and moving the crate with my grandfather's letters to a safer, elevated position. My hands were sore, my arms ached. But the sense of accomplishment was profound. I had survived Karen's escalation, protected my property, and asserted control where I could. Then, As twilight settled over the yard, casting long shadows across the reinforced fence, a new sound shattered the fragile calm, a loud, metallic grinding from the barn's roof. My stomach dropped. I rushed to the barn, flashlight sweeping across the darkened space, and saw the horror immediately. A section of the roof, weakened perhaps by previous tampering or deliberate sabotage, was collapsing. The beams bent unnaturally, threatening to crash down on the barn and the crate below. Dust and debris fell, and my heart raced as I realized the full extent of the danger. My grandfather's letters, my barn, everything I had fought to protect suddenly all at risk again. Karen stood outside, her expression unreadable but calm, almost detached, as if the chaos she had caused was nothing more than a demonstration of power. Boundaries, she said softly, almost philosophically, are fragile. Sometimes, it takes just the right pressure to expose them. I stared at the collapsing roof, heart pounding, adrenaline surging. This was more than intimidation now. This was a direct, life-threatening escalation. I knew I had to act fast to prevent disaster. My mind raced for a solution, any solution. As I grabbed ropes, beams, and tools to try and brace the structure before it came down completely. And as I worked, sweat pouring from my body, hands shaking, dogs circling anxiously, I realized one terrifying truth. Karen's final move had arrived. The extreme event I had feared for weeks, the one that would push me to my absolute limits, was unfolding before me. The barn, the letters, and my resolve were all on the line. The barn roof groaned, a terrifying chorus of bending wood and strained metal. Dust and debris rained down, clouding the air, and my dogs barked frantically, circling in protective patterns. My heart raced uncontrollably, adrenaline surging as I realized the full scale of the threat. Every second counted. One misstep, one delay, and everything I had fought for, my barn, my grandfather's letters, my sense of control, could be destroyed in an instant. I leapt into action. Using ropes and sturdy wooden beams, I began bracing the collapsing roof, positioning each support as carefully as possible. My hands were raw, my arms aching from the weeks of labor, but I refused to stop. I had survived Karen's psychological games, her sabotage of the fence, and her attempts to intimidate me physically, but this was the ultimate test of resilience. Karen watched silently from the yard, her calm demeanor unnerving. She held her clipboard loosely at her side, as if the chaos she had orchestrated were merely a demonstration, not a threat. Determination, she said softly, almost to herself, is admirable, but even determination can't prevent collapse forever. I ignored her words, focusing instead on the immediate task. One beam at a time. I propped up the sagging roof, securing it with ropes and metal braces. Each movement was deliberate, precise. The roof creaked and groaned under the strain. But slowly, inch by inch, the worst of the collapse was held back. My dogs remained vigilant, ears perked, alert to any additional threats. Then came a loud snap, another beam giving way. Dust and splinters exploded around me, and I stumbled backward, heart hammering. I grabbed another support beam and pushed forward, sweat stinging my eyes. Every instinct screamed to flee, but I couldn't. My grandfather's letters were in that barn. The memories, the legacy, everything I cherished, they were all in jeopardy. Karen's voice cut through the chaos, calm and measured. You see, sometimes the past is fragile, and sometimes it takes extreme measures to test whether someone truly deserves to hold on to it. I clenched my teeth, determination surging. I refused to let her words shake me. Instead, I leaned into the struggle, using every ounce of strength and ingenuity I had accumulated over the past weeks. Each plank I positioned, each rope I tied, felt like a declaration. I would not be intimidated. I would not be defeated. The barn roof shifted again, threatening to collapse entirely, and my heart leapt into my throat. I called out to my dogs, instructing them to stay back momentarily, while I adjusted the main support beam. They obeyed, eyes wide and alert, as I slid a long, sturdy beam into position, wedging it securely between the remaining stable posts and the floor. The roof groaned in protest but held. At least for now. Karen stepped closer, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Impressive," she said, almost approvingly. "You've faced every obstacle I've placed before you. But how far will you go to protect what's yours?" I looked at her, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down my face. "As far as it takes," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. "I will protect what's mine. You will not take it." Her smile faltered slightly, and I realized something. Karen thrived on control, on watching others struggle and bend under pressure. But she had underestimated me. She had assumed that constant intimidation, sabotage, and escalation would break me, but it had only strengthened my resolve. I took a step back and assessed the barn. The roof, though unstable, was now supported by multiple beams and braces. The crate with my grandfather's letters was secure, elevated above the debris. The fence, though previously damaged, was now fully reinforced, stronger than ever, and impossible to breach easily. Every piece of property, every symbol of my persistence, was now under my control. Karen's eyes narrowed as she studied the scene, realization dawning. I could see it in her posture, in the slight hesitation in her step. She had pushed me to my limits, expecting fear and surrender, but instead, she found resilience and strategic action. Suddenly, she spoke, her voice sharp, almost impatient. "You think this ends here? This isn't over, not by a long shot." I held my ground. "It is over for now. You've tested me. You've tried to intimidate me. But I've proven that I will not back down. I will protect what's mine. And I will not let you, or anyone else, control me." Karen's expression hardened, but after a long pause, she finally turned away, walking slowly toward the edge of the yard. "We shall see," she said over her shoulder, voice low but deliberate. "We shall see." As she disappeared into the shadows, I allowed myself a long exhale. My hands trembled from exertion, my arms ached, but a profound sense of relief and accomplishment washed over me. I had survived every challenge, every escalation, every attempt to intimidate or sabotage me. I had reclaimed control, defended my property, and protected my grandfather's legacy. I looked at the barn, standing strong despite the near collapse, and at the fully reinforced fence surrounding my property. My dogs padded close, tails wagging cautiously, sensing my relief. I knelt, running my hands over the crate containing the letters, feeling the weight of history and memories safe in my care. In that moment, I realized the lesson Karen's harassment had inadvertently taught me. Courage isn't just about facing fear. It's about persistence, strategic thinking, and protecting what you value. Kindness and empathy may guide our actions toward others, but strength and determination are sometimes necessary to protect what is rightfully ours. As twilight faded into night, I stepped back and surveyed my yard. The barn stood tall, the fence secure, and my grandfather's letters were safe. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and growth. I had been tested, pushed to my limits, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. And though Karen had not given up entirely, and her presence still loomed in my mind, I knew one thing with certainty. I had taken back control. I had reclaimed my property, my safety, and my peace of mind. I sat on the porch, watching my dogs play quietly in the yard, and reflected on everything that had transpired. Fear, frustration, and anger had been constant companions, but they had been tempered by patience, strategy, and resilience. I had learned to stand firm, to think clearly under pressure, and to protect what mattered most. Where are you watching from?